Before we begin, a quick note about how this episode was created. This episode uses AI-generated narration to bring Dr. Jackal's voice and character to life. However, the ideas, framing, and wording are my own. Dr. Alyssa R. Jones. The content has been synthesized, paraphrased, and adapted from history of psychology textbooks, scholarly work, lectures, professors, and other educational resources that have shaped my understanding of psychology, science, philosophy, and the mind. AI is used as a creative teaching tool, but the educational interpretation, organization, and teaching perspective come from me. Some wording may be condensed or adapted for clarity, accessibility, and narrative flow. This episode is designed to support learning, discussion, and historical engagement, and to invite students into the ideas, not replace the original sources. Welcome back to Dr. Jackal's History and Systems of Psychology podcast, where we trace the strange, brilliant, and occasionally messy road that made psychology into a science. I'm Dr. Jackal, your lab mascot guide through the laboratories, classrooms, clinics, testing rooms, army camps, and questionable scoring systems that shaped psychology's next major turn. Today, psychology leaves the lab and starts trying to solve problems in the real world, which is exciting and dangerous. Because once psychology starts measuring people, classifying people, diagnosing people, sorting people, hiring people, educating people, and deciding who is fit or unfit, the stakes get much higher. Today's warning label: numbers can look objective even when the assumptions underneath them are doing a lot of very suspicious work. In this episode, we are not just memorizing a timeline. We are tracking how psychologists changed what counted as evidence, what counted as science, and what counted as the mind in the first place. Last time, we saw American psychology become increasingly functional, applied, developmental, and practical. Functionalists asked what the mind does and how organisms adapt to their environments. Today, that practical spirit expands even further. Psychology becomes useful. It enters schools, clinics, businesses, immigration offices, the military, courtrooms, hospitals, and public life. This is the rise of applied psychology and mental testing. And like most of psychology's history, it is both inspiring and unsettling. Because the same tools that can help identify students who need support can also be used to label people unfairly. The same measurements that can help psychology become more scientific can also be used to justify discrimination. So today we are going to follow that tension. Psychology wanted to measure human difference. The question was, what would it do with those measurements? Part 1. Psychology gets practical. By the early 20th century, psychology in the United States was becoming much more practical. This was partly because of functionalism. Functionalists believed psychology should study how people function in real environments: schools, workplaces, homes, institutions, social settings. American culture also valued usefulness. The United States had a strong pragmatic spirit. People wanted knowledge that worked. So psychology increasingly moved away from Titchener's idea that psychology should be a pure science devoted only to analyzing the structure of consciousness. Functionalists and applied psychologists said, what if psychology could improve education? What if it could help children? What if it could guide vocational decisions? What if it could treat mental distress? What if it could select workers? What if it could classify soldiers? What if it could measure intelligence? These questions helped psychology expand rapidly. But they also brought new ethical problems. Because when psychologists begin applying their science to real people, their theories do not stay in textbooks. They affect lives. That is one of the major lessons of this episode. Part 2. Individual differences become central. A major theme in applied psychology was the study of individual differences. Remember, Darwin's theory of evolution made variation important. If individuals vary, and if those variations matter for adaptation, then psychologists began to ask how people differ in ability, reaction time, sensory sensitivity, intelligence, personality, learning, and performance. Francis Galton had already pushed psychology toward the measurement of individual differences. He believed that mental abilities could be inherited and measured. He developed statistical tools and early testing methods, but his work was also deeply tied to eugenics. That matters, because mental testing develops in the shadow of both scientific curiosity and social judgment. Psychologists wanted objective tools. They wanted numbers. They wanted to classify differences. But they were working in a society full of racism, sexism, classism, ableism, nationalism, and eugenic thinking. So the question becomes, Can a psychological test ever be separated from the assumptions of the culture that creates it? That question is still alive today. Part 3. James McKeen Cattell and Mental Tests. One important figure in early mental testing was James McKeen Cattell. Cattell studied with one and later became one of the major early American psychologists. He was influenced by Galton's work on individual differences and measurement. Cattell believed psychology should be practical and objective. He wanted to use tests to measure mental abilities in a scientific way. In fact, he helped popularize the term mental tests. Now, Cattell's early mental tests were not like modern intelligence tests. They often measured things like reaction time, sensory discrimination, grip strength, and other simple processes. This reflected the assumption that basic sensory and motor abilities might reveal general intellectual ability. The logic was something like this. If intelligence depends on the nervous system, then maybe sharper sensory discrimination or faster reaction time indicates a better functioning mind. That idea made sense to many researchers at the time, but it did not work very well. Cattell's tests did not strongly predict academic success. Students who performed well on sensory or reaction time tasks were not necessarily the students who performed best in school. That was a problem. But Cattell's contributions still mattered. He helped establish the idea that psychological abilities could be tested objectively. He helped make individual differences a major subject of psychology, and he helped push psychology toward measurement, testing, and applied work. Even when the first tests failed, the testing movement did not stop. It changed direction. And that brings us to Alfred Binet. Part 4. Alfred Binet and the Original Purpose of Intelligence Testing. Alfred Binet is one of the most important figures in the history of intelligence testing, and his original goal is worth remembering carefully. Binet was not trying to rank all people permanently from best to worst. He was not trying to prove that intelligence was fixed. He was not trying to create a tool for eugenic sorting. His goal was much more practical and humane. In France, Binet was asked to help identify children who might need additional educational support. The concern was that some children were struggling in school and needed special assistance. So Binet and his colleague Theodore Simon developed what became known as the Binet-Simon scale. The test included tasks designed to measure judgment, reasoning, comprehension, attention, and problem solving. This was different from earlier tests that focused mainly on sensory and motor abilities. Binet believed intelligence involved higher mental processes. He was interested in how children solved problems, understood questions, followed directions, and reasoned. One important concept associated with Binet's work was mental age. Mental age refers to the level of intellectual performance typical of children at a certain chronological age. For example, if a 6-year-old child performed at a level typical of 8-year-olds, the child might be said to have a mental age of 8. If a 10-year-old performed at a level typical of 7-year-olds, the child might be said to have a mental age of 7. The point was to identify children who might need help. Binet also warned against treating intelligence as fixed or unchangeable. That warning is important because once intelligence testing traveled into other cultural and institutional settings, the tool changed, and in some cases, it was used in ways Binet himself would likely have criticized. Part 5. The test crosses the Atlantic. When intelligence testing came to the United States, it entered a very different cultural environment. American psychology was practical, ambitious, and increasingly connected to schools, immigration, industry, and the military. The United States was also deeply shaped by eugenics, racism, class hierarchy, and anxiety about immigration. So intelligence testing did not simply arrive as a neutral educational tool. It became part of larger debates about who was capable, who was normal, who was educable, who should reproduce, and who belonged. That is where the history becomes troubling. Tests that were originally developed to identify children needing educational support became tools for ranking, classifying, and sometimes excluding people. This shift shows us something very important. A psychological test is not only a scientific instrument, it is also a social instrument. It can open doors, it can close doors, it can help people receive services, it can also label them in ways that follow them for life. That is why the ethics of testing matter so much. Part 6. Henry Goddard and the Dark Side of Testing. One major figure in the American testing movement was Henry Herbert Goddard. Goddard helped introduce and popularize the Binet test in the United States. He translated and adapted the test and used it in institutional settings. Goddard was especially interested in what he called feeble-mindedness, a term used at the time to describe people believed to have intellectual limitations. That term is outdated and harmful now, but it was central to the language of the period. Goddard believed that intellectual ability was largely inherited. He also believed that people with low intelligence posed a threat to society if they reproduced. This placed his work directly within the eugenics movement. One of Goddard's most famous and damaging works was The Kallikak Family. In it, he claimed to trace two family lines from one man, one supposedly respectable and successful, the other supposedly marked by disability, poverty, crime, and social problems. Goddard used this story to argue that intelligence and moral character were inherited. The study was later heavily criticized for poor methods, biased interpretation, and eugenic assumptions. But at the time, it had influence. Goddard also used intelligence testing with immigrants at Ellis Island. Many immigrants were labeled intellectually deficient based on tests that were often culturally biased, linguistically inappropriate, and administered under stressful conditions. Imagine arriving in a new country after a difficult journey, perhaps not speaking English, perhaps exhausted or frightened, and then being tested in a way that assumes you understand the language, culture, expectations, and testing situation. That is not a neutral measure of intelligence. That is a test of power, context, language, and access. Goddard's work is a warning. Psychological testing can look objective while being deeply shaped by cultural bias, and when bias tests are linked to policy, the consequences can be devastating. Part 7. Lewis Terman and the Stanford Binet. Another major figure was Lewis Terman. Terman revised Binet's test at Stanford University, creating the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale. This became one of the most influential intelligence tests in American psychology. Terman helped popularize the use of the IQ, or intelligence quotient. The traditional formula was mental age divided by chronological age, multiplied by 100. So if a child's mental age matched their chronological age, the IQ would be 100. If mental age was higher than chronological age, the IQ would be above 100. If mental age was lower, the IQ would be below 100. Terman believed intelligence was largely inherited, and he supported using intelligence tests to classify people. He also believed testing could identify gifted children. In fact, Terman conducted a famous longitudinal study of gifted children, sometimes called the termites, though the children themselves probably did not request that charming insect branding. His study followed intellectually gifted children over time and helped challenge some stereotypes about gifted children being weak, sickly, or socially maladjusted. But Terman's work also had a troubling side. Like many psychologists of his era, he accepted eugenic assumptions. He believed intelligence testing could help society identify people who should be encouraged or discouraged from reproducing. Again, we see the double legacy of testing. On one hand, intelligence testing helped psychology become more applied and scientifically visible. On the other hand, it was used to support exclusion, classification, and social control. That contradiction is part of psychology's history. Part 8. The Army Alpha and Beta Tests. World War I gave psychologists a major opportunity to prove the usefulness of mental testing. The United States military needed to classify large numbers of recruits quickly. Psychologists saw a chance to demonstrate that their methods could help solve a national problem. Robert Yerkes, who was president of the APA at the time, helped lead the effort to develop group intelligence tests for the Army. Two major tests were created, the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. The Army Alpha was designed for literate recruits who could read and write English. The Army Beta was designed for recruits who were illiterate or did not speak English fluently. The goal was to classify soldiers by intellectual ability and assign them to appropriate roles. From psychology's perspective, this was a major public demonstration of the field's practical value. Testing was efficient. It looked scientific. It produced numbers. It could be used by institutions. But the Army testing program also had serious problems. Many recruits were tested under poor conditions. The tests were culturally and linguistically biased. The results were often interpreted as evidence of innate intelligence differences among racial, ethnic, and national groups. Those interpretations reinforced racist and nativist beliefs. So once again, measurement became entangled with social prejudice. The Army testing program helped psychology gain status, but it also helped spread the idea that intelligence tests could rank entire groups of people in ways that reflected biological worth. That is one of the most painful lessons in the history of applied psychology. A method can advance a field and harm people at the same time. Part 9, Clinical Psychology and Leitner-Whitmer. Applied psychology was not limited to intelligence testing. It also included the rise of clinical psychology. One key figure here was Leitner-Whitmer. Whitmer is often credited with founding clinical psychology in the United States. He established a psychological clinic at the University of Pennsylvania in 1896. His work focused largely on children who were having difficulties in school. Whitmer believed psychology could be used to assess and treat individual problems. This was a major shift. Psychology was not only studying general laws of mind or behavior, it was helping specific people with specific difficulties. Whitmer's clinical work involved assessment, diagnosis, educational intervention, and practical support. He also founded the journal, The Psychological Clinic. The term clinical psychology comes from this tradition of working directly with individuals in need of help. Whitmer's approach was practical and applied. It reflected the functionalist spirit. Psychology should help people adapt and function more effectively. Clinical psychology would later become one of the largest and most visible areas of the field. But in its early years, it was closely tied to education, child study, and assessment. That connection makes sense. Schools were one of the first major places where psychological problems were identified and addressed. If a child struggled to learn, behave, attend, communicate, or adapt, psychologists were called in to help understand why. That practical role helped psychology become useful in everyday life. Part 10. Hugo Münsterberg and Industrial Psychology. Dr. Jackal. Another major applied psychologist was Hugo Münsterberg. Münsterberg had studied with Wundt and later came to the United States, where he worked at Harvard. He was interested in applying psychology to practical problems in business, law, medicine, education, and industry. In industrial psychology, Münsterberg argued that psychological methods could help match people to jobs. The idea was that workers differ in abilities, attention, reaction time, temperament, and performance. Jobs also differ in demands. So, psychology could help identify which people were best suited for which kinds of work. This is one of the roots of industrial organizational psychology. Münsterberg also studied issues related to fatigue, efficiency, advertising, and employee selection. He believes psychology could improve productivity and reduce errors. Again, we see psychology becoming useful, but we also see the same ethical tension. If psychology helps match people to jobs, that can be beneficial. But if it is used to control workers, justify inequality, or treat people as machinery, then the practical power of psychology becomes more troubling. Münsterberg was also interested in psychology and law. He wrote about eyewitness testimony, false confession, memory errors, and courtroom decision-making. That makes him especially important for later applied work in forensic psychology. He argued that psychology had something valuable to offer the legal system because human memory and perception are fallible. That insight has only become more important over time. Part 11, Psychology and the Law. The legal system became one of the places where applied psychology could show its value. Courtrooms depend heavily on human perception, memory, judgment, confession, and testimony. But psychology shows that these processes are not perfect. People misremember. Witnesses make mistakes. Confidence can be misleading. Suggestion can alter memory. Stress can affect perception. Lineups can be biased. Jurors bring assumptions into the courtroom. Early applied psychologists like Münsterberg argued that psychology should be taken seriously in legal settings. At the time, many legal professionals resisted this. Judges and attorneys often assumed that common sense was enough to evaluate witnesses and evidence. Psychologists argued that common sense was not enough. Human memory and judgment needed scientific study. This is another example of psychology moving into real-world institutions. The laboratory was no longer enough. Psychology wanted to shape schools, clinics, workplaces, armies, and courts. And that expansion helped make psychology more visible and powerful. Part 12. The Ethics of Measurement. At this point, we need to pause and talk about the ethics of measurement. Because episode 11 is not just a story about psychology becoming useful, it is a story about psychology becoming powerful. When psychologists measure people, they create categories: normal and abnormal, gifted and delayed, fit and unfit, high ability and low ability, employable and unemployable, educable and uneducable, reliable and unreliable. Those categories can help. They can direct resources. They can identify needs. They can guide interventions. They can support learning. They can improve treatment. But they can also harm. They can stigmatize. They can exclude. They can justify discrimination. They can be mistaken for destiny. They can turn cultural privilege into a test score. This is one of the central tensions in applied psychology. Psychology wants to be useful, but usefulness without humility can become control. Measurement without context can become injustice. A number can look clean even when the world that produced it is messy. That is why we need history. History helps us see that tests are not just technical tools, they are cultural artifacts. They reflect assumptions about ability, normality, success, intelligence, development, and human worth. And those assumptions must always be questioned. Part 13. How Applied Psychology Expanded the Field. Despite its problems, applied psychology transformed the field. It expanded psychology's subject matter. Psychologists no longer studied only adult consciousness in laboratories. They studied children, students, workers, immigrants, soldiers, patients, witnesses, families, organizations. Applied psychology also expanded psychology's methods. Psychologists used tests, rating scales, interviews, observations, questionnaires, clinical assessments, school records, work samples, and performance measures. This was a major departure from the narrow, introspective methods of earlier psychology. Applied psychology also strengthened psychology's public identity. People began to see psychology as a field that could do something. It could classify, diagnose, advise, treat, select, educate, predict, improve. That practical power made psychology attractive to institutions. Schools wanted psychologists. Businesses wanted psychologists. The military wanted psychologists. Clinics wanted psychologists. Courts began to hear from psychologists. Psychology became part of modern life. But with that expansion came responsibility. Psychologists had to ask not only whether their tools worked, but for whom they worked, under what conditions, and with what consequences. Part 14. Applied Psychology as a Bridge to Behaviorism. Applied psychology also helped prepare the way for behaviorism. Why? Because applied psychologists were often less interested in consciousness and more interested in observable performance. What does the child do? How does the worker perform? How does the soldier respond? How does the patient behave? How does the witness remember? How does the test taker answer? This practical orientation pushed psychology toward behavior, measurement, prediction, and control. Those themes fit beautifully with the coming behaviorist movement. Watson would later argue that psychology should abandon consciousness entirely and focus only on observable behavior. But before Watson, the field was already moving in that direction. Functionalism had shifted psychology toward adaptation and usefulness. Applied psychology had shifted psychology toward performance and practical outcomes. Animal psychology had shifted psychology toward observable behavior. Testing had shifted psychology toward measurement and prediction. So when behaviorism arrived, it did not come out of nowhere. The ground had already been prepared. The zeitgeist was ready for a psychology that was objective, useful, measurable, and focused on behavior. Watson would become the loudest voice, but the movement toward objectivity had already begun. Part 15. Pulling it all together. So let's pull this episode together. Applied psychology grew from the functionalist spirit. If psychology studies how organisms adapt, then it makes sense to apply psychology to real problems of adaptation. Schools wanted to know how children learn. Clinics wanted to know how to help people struggling. Businesses wanted to know how to select workers. The military wanted to classify recruits. Courts needed to understand memory and testimony. Society wanted tools to measure human difference. Cattell helped popularize mental tests and the measurement of individual differences. Binet developed intelligence testing to identify children who needed educational support. Goddard brought intelligence testing into American eugenic thinking and institutional classification. Terman revised the Binet test into the Stanford Binet and helped popularize IQ. Yerkes in the Army testing program showed psychology's usefulness on a massive scale, while also spreading biased interpretations of group differences. Wittmer helped found clinical psychology by applying psychology to individual cases and school difficulties. Münsterberg helped expand psychology into industry, law, and applied settings. Together, these figures made psychology more practical and more powerful, but they also made psychology more ethically complicated. That is the point. Applied psychology shows us that science does not simply produce knowledge. It produces tools, and tools can be used well or badly. They can liberate or limit, they can help people receive support, or they can justify excluding them. That is why psychology must always examine its assumptions, especially when it claims to measure human worth. The big takeaway from today's episode is that psychology changed through argument, measurement, method, and cultural pressure. The names matter. Cattell matters, Binet matters, Simon matters, Goddard matters, Terman matters, Yerkes matters, Whitmer matters, Münsterberg matters, but the pattern matters more. Each figure or movement is responding to a problem left behind by the last one. Functionalism asked what psychology could do. Applied psychology answered by entering schools, clinics, workplaces, the military, and the law. Mental testing promised objectivity and practical usefulness, but it also revealed how easily measurement can become entangled with prejudice, power, and social control. This episode shows psychology becoming more useful, more visible, and more dangerous, and that prepares us for the next turn. Because once psychology becomes focused on objective measurement, observable performance, prediction, and control, behaviorism is waiting just outside the door. That's where we'll pause today. Keep thinking historically, keep questioning scientifically, and remember, every theory has a backstory. This is Dr. Jackal, signing off.